Welcome, fellow tarot travelers, tripping through the tetrahedral triptych of cards I shall lay before you. I'm Tarot Torch, and today we have some very important topics to cover. The first one is, did you know that there are Russian bombers that have arrived and are parked in the economically distraught country of Venezuela, very close to the American border? A socio-economic and political crisis has been erupting in Venezuela since 2010 under the presidency of Hugo Chavez and continues through to the current presidency of Nicolas Maduro. The current situation is the worst economic crisis in Venezuela's history and among the worst crises experienced in the Americas, with hyperinflation, soaring hunger, disease, crime, soaring death rates, and massive emigration from the country. The contraction of national and per capita GDPs in Venezuela between 2013 and 2017 was more severe than that of the United States during the Great Depression, or of Russia, Cuba, and Albania following the collapse of the Soviet Union. In recent years, the annual inflation rate for consumer prices rose hundreds and thousands of percentage points, while the economy contracted nearly 20% annually. This economic collapse has made Venezuela one of the most violent countries in the world. December 10, 2018, two of Russia's most modern, nuclear-capable bombers landed in Venezuela earlier this week. The arrival of the Tu-160 White Swan strategic bombers in Caracas on Monday displays to the United States that Russia can still project military might into the Western Hemisphere. The Tu-160 bombers were manufactured at the end of the Cold War and are among the most advanced strategic bombers in the world. They can fly at twice the speed of sound and carry both conventional and nuclear-armed cruise missiles that have a range of more than 3,400 miles. It's not known whether the Russian bombers were carrying any kind of armament, nuclear or non-nuclear, on their quote-unquote visit to Venezuela. The bombers' deployment follows Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro's visit to Moscow last week in a bid to shore up political and economic assistance, even as his country has been struggling to pay billions of dollars owed to Russia. Russia is a major ally of Venezuela, which has become increasingly isolated in the world under growing sanctions led by the US and the EU, which accuse Maduro of undermining democratic institutions to hold power. Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu said at last week's meeting with his Venezuelan counterpart, Vladimir Padrino Lopez, said that Russia would continue to send its military aircraft and warships to visit Venezuela as part of a bilateral military cooperation. Well, this brings up an awful lot of questions to any average American. At what point will Russia have a permanent presence in Venezuela? Will Russia mount international bombing raids on other countries in South or North America from this location? Do Russian nuclear arms in Venezuela permit Russia to build permanent bases and expand its presence in South and North America because no country wants nuclear confrontations? Will America stop this Russian expansionism before it extends into Cuba, Peru, Colombia, and Bolivia on its way to Mexico? Will we have wars in South America, as well as Syria, Crimea, Kaliningrad, the Baltic states, and several Stan states like Dagestan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and Azerbaijan? Will this cause a world war with Russia and the BRICS nations, or will it begin another longful, painful Cold War? Well, these are the questions that are unanswerable to us at this point in time. And when we don't have an answer, it's time to ask the cards. That's where tarot works best. when we have unanswerable questions that need answering. So today I would like to use a deck I just recently used in a previous video entitled Russia, where you can hear more about this deck. And it's a deck called Born in the USSR by Alexander Danilov, where it is only the higher arcane cards, and these pictures are from old Soviet Union propaganda posters. Once again, I am not a communist, and I use these cards to understand what is going on in Russia. But these cards only explain Russia. What will I use for Venezuela? It turns out that Venezuela doesn't really have its own tarot cards, at least to my research. And even if I found a deck, it would be almost impossible to acquire one from that country right now. So instead, I'm using Fournier's poker, Naipe Poker Español. Now, the Naipe Poker Español is a deck of cards that is used in the casinos in Spain. And it turns out that this type of a card made by Fournier is called barajas. And barajas cards are used not just in Spain, but throughout Spanish-speaking South America, Central America, and the Philippines. And in these countries, instead of using, let's say, the 5 of clubs or the 5 of diamonds, they use the 7 of coins, or they use the Queen of clubs. And all of the cards are like a Western deck that is modern, but they use the cups, the coins, the swords, and the wands of the ancient tarot tradition as being the suits for their cards. And this is what people will play in the casinos and in the local cafes when they play cards. However, this being a poker edition, it goes from ace to 10, then it does jack, queen, and king. But the ace to 10 is the unique thing. Most baraja decks only go from ace to 9. Only the poker edition does it through 10, and that's what we need to do tarot readings. There's no higher arcana in this deck, but there is a higher arcana located here. So between the two, we have a full deck. And it is important to realize we need the higher arcana to be from Russia because they're in a lofty position. They are the ones loaning Venezuela the money. They are the ones loaning Venezuela the military protection. Venezuela is the one in the lesser position and doesn't have the higher arcana. It doesn't have the resources and the money at this time, and it is the one that is in trouble. So it is absolutely appropriate to use these two decks. So we'll begin by shuffling the two decks just a little bit and cutting them to make sure that indeed everyone sees that these are going to be card readings on the cuff, unedited, and usually I make my films just in one try only. And so, because there's a freshness to the first try, unless there's a big blunder. And so we're going to try to make this all happen right now before you, the viewing audience. So with the Russian cards, we'll just use one card as the indicator of what we're doing here. And for the baraja cards, we'll use 3 cards. So first, let's see what's going on in Venezuela. We have the 7 of Cups. We have the 2 of Swords. And we have the 2 of Wands. Or in this case, I prefer the term clubs because these are a club-type artistic rendition, and they don't look like a wand or a rod or a baton, as the French would call them. So with this configuration, what we see is that Venezuela is having to make a big decision, and it's dealing with boundary border issues, and it may be economic boundaries and economic borders. Certainly sanctions are going to be imposed on Venezuela, especially if it's siding with Russia at this time. And so boundaries, borders, and insights and decisions are indicated by the Two of Swords. The Seven of Cups, however, is actually rooted in the interpretation of a suitor visiting a family, especially seeking to have a young lady's hand in marriage. And so you're dealing with an outsider like Russia coming in to their country. Now, in this case, the Venezuelans feel that they need Russian protection because of their long socialist communist history to keep them protected from gringoism of the United States and the West. They don't want Western imperialism taking over their country. And they make a reasonable argument, looking at their past and the past of South America, that this can be problematic. The outcome card here is the Two of Clubs. And the Two of Clubs has a lot to do with reaching a crossroads. Venezuela is at a crossroads right now. It must determine whether it is going to be capitalist or communist, aligned with BRICS or aligned with the West. Venezuela is sitting on some of the richest oil deposits in the entire world, as well as enormously rich mineral deposits. But Venezuela doesn't want to be raped of its minerals and oil, and it'll be left with a ruined landscape and no money in its pocket from exploitive sources like Russia or the United States. And yet, because of the hyper-spending under Chavez's regime, where he was flamboyantly spending money all over the place, endlessly, with corruption among himself and other leading dignitaries beneath him, the country has been basically ripped off of all of its holdings and has no money, and yet it's sitting on the biggest oil supply in the world. So you can see why Russia and America are interested, especially Russia, because Russia has large oil holdings and wants to serve the European Union and China, but America and Britain are trying to stop that. They want their oil interests to serve the world. Well, let's see what Russia's doing with these aircraft in Venezuela. So from the Russian viewpoint and the Venezuelan viewpoint, this is an issue of justice. Now let's bring these cards up so you can see. This is the card of justice. And it speaks of not just social justice indicated here, but false justice created by communist revolution and true divine justice from higher sources. And that divinity may be the voice of the people, the needs of the people, the needs of nature. But in some sense, Russia seems to feel that it is a just source of countervailing political might and military might in a region that would otherwise succumb to American imperialism and land exploitation. And so the Venezuelans, with the Seven of Cups, have accepted into their country a stranger, an outsider, in the hopes of some kind of bonding or marriage with that country through covenants, contracts, treaties, and trade. And yet, boundaries need to be established that are very clear between Russia and Venezuela, because Russia too can be an exploitive force to their economy and to their resources. And yet Venezuela is not getting what it wants out of Russia. Venezuela still is at the crossroads. Now let's see how this crossroads will be dealt with by pulling out a couple more cards. And we see the cards that were brought out are the Ten of Swords. Actually, in this case, they more look like knives. And the Seven of Knives. And what the Ten of Knives speaks of is complete death, a complete end to their method of government, a complete end to the ruling hierarchy, a complete end of the country known as Venezuela as we have known it today. Now, I'm not saying it's going to be a Russian-speaking satellite nation for Putin, but what we know as Venezuela will not continue. And the key to its change and transformation is located in the Seven of Swords, which has to do with strategy and planning, sharpness of mind. And so what we see here is a configuration of Venezuela making a strategic move to abnegate its debt by restructuring and an ending of the old regime, a creating of a new nation, much like going through bankruptcy, not having to pay the debtors because the old government, the old name of the country, the old flag of the country, however far they wish to take this, is no longer present to pay the bill. Russia will be the country that then presides over this, since they're the country to whom the debt is owed, and they will be the ones rendering justice in this regard. And this will be the economic salvation of Venezuela. So we should look forward to some kind of verdict from the Russian courts or from the Russian government in the managing of the Venezuelan national identity at this point, because it's collapsing so badly. It's just basically a criminal warlord no man's land of dystopia as we see it today unfolding. Something needs to be done, and bombers from Russia certainly are not the answer. Let's just hope that's part of a political spectrum of action to save the poor, suffering people in the country of Venezuela.